Hello and welcome to another episode of the Technical SEO podcast. My name is Dan Taylor, and today I am joined by Jarno van Driel, who is joining me to talk about Schema. Good morning, Jarno.
Good morning, Dan. Hope you're doing well.
I'm doing well, thank you. And thank you for taking time out to come on the podcast. For everyone who doesn't know you in the SEO industry, which hopefully won't be that many people, would you just like to give yourself a quick introduction, please?
Long time digital presence. Built my first website in 1998. Became one of the first front-end developers in the Netherlands, early 2000. From there, I became a technical SEO specialist. And as of around 2011, when Schema.org launched, I sort of made an early switch to becoming a structured data specialist. And I've been doing that mostly ever since, which obviously always involves SEO, but with the focus on structuring data.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think 95% of conversations we've ever had have been around structured data.
Yeah, I
We,
can be boring probably.
I think when you're really that deep into technical SEO, not talking about SEO with other SEOs is kind of weird. Um, I don't know how to interact with normal people. I'm going to say normal people outside of. Yeah. So that kind of nicely segues onto what we're going to be talking about today, which is structured data, schema, markup, and I know just before we kind of came on air, we had a couple of little chats around what kind of topics kind of look at, and there's a few burning observations and kind of viewpoints you have at the moment. And kind of the first one we touched base on was that around the product variant markup. So just for everyone listening who might not be aware of it, can you just give a quick introduction to what the product variant markup is?
Well, product variants for a long time have been a big issue for organic search because Google Organic never supported the idea of product variants. So let's say a pair of sneakers you have in 5 different colors, in 12 different sizes, meaning you actually have one sneaker, but you have variants of that sneaker. That's something Google Shopping and Merchant Center has supported for like forever already, but Google Organic did not. And with the upcoming crossover between Google Shopping and Google Organic, there was a need over at Google to start supporting product variant markup. And that's an issue we've been talking about over at Schema.org for more than a decade already. And or the post that actually led to the new markup is a post I started over at GitHub myself, trying to convince Google to finally start supporting product variant markup, because the issue was that what we needed to do for Merchant Center was contradicting what we needed to do on the organic side of things. So there's now finally a process of alignment and achieving parity that has been started. And that's really important.
So what we're kind of saying there is somehow you found a way to get Google internal departments to talk to each other and align on something.
Now,
Maybe
I kept kicking shins over at Schema.org for like a decade until finally somebody decided to listen. And for Google, it's a simple business decision. For a long time, shopping and organic needed to stay separated. So there was no motivation for them to align organic with Merchant Center. But with the crossover that's continuously growing between organic and Merchant Center, there's now an actual need for them to start aligning those two. And that's a process we started roughly 3 years ago with a lot of tickets and a lot of discussions. Right now, the first step has been taken by Google some months back to launch the first edition of product variant markup so that the world can start growing accustomed to publishing this sort of thing. It's a multi-year process. Nobody's convinced the world will adopt this in 6 months and we can continue blindly.
no, absolutely. We're kind of building on that then. Like you said, it's a multi-year process, and I know kind of in the SEO world, the value of schema-related projects has always been discussed, whether or not it is going to show the ROI, the time investment, because it does require that time investment. And that kind of draws onto kind of a second topic that I know we've been kind of discussing beforehand, and this is something which you expressed a viewpoint on, that you anecdotally potentially see agencies and organizations kind of pulling back resource from schema related projects.
Yeah, it's as opposed to staying pragmatically in the middle. I'm seeing organizations and SEOs depart in either left or right directions. On the left direction, people are publishing more and more and more and more because they are finally started to read Schema.org, but they're over publishing their markup, believing that everything inside Schema.org is of value for their SEO. And that's not the case. If you want to know what's of value for your SEO, just stick with the Google's documentation. That suffices. But on the right side, you now got a lot of organizations that are presuming that the LLMs and AI are so good now, there's no longer any need for markup. And that's potentially a biggest risk you can take as a business, because the reason Google has its documentation and need for markup is because LLMs or AI are not capable to produce that markup in such a consistent and useful manner. Markup is great if it's generated by AI to create data sets for the AI. But to really have AI create data sets that can be used to create search features like rich results, you need a highly consistent data set. And LLMs are not able to produce those data sets consistently enough. So if you're believing now that markup doesn't matter anymore and you leave it up to Google, there's a good chance you're going to be missing out on a lot of things, especially if you're in the e-commerce space.
One interesting thing you kind of touched on there, and I'm curious to get your viewpoint on this, is just that relationship between structured data and how the LLMs are processing information, because there's certain camps in the SEO community who see the structured data tying to the knowledge graph, and then obviously LLMs using the knowledge graph and using entities within there to derive information and make assumptions. Your viewpoint on this?
Markup doesn't have a place directly in educating the LLM, in the sense that I did a test not so long ago where I wrote a long story containing 95% of the facts in markup in the content, but 100% of the facts in the markup. And 6 months later, the LLMs like ChatGPT or Gemini were able to provide me with answers based on the things it had found in the natural content, but not the additional facts I had added to the markup. In my mind, that makes total sense, because the proposition of markup is that it's supposed to be a translation of the actual content. So if you're stuffing additional things in the markup, it should be ignored. And I think even within the world of LLMs, people are thinking that they can add all those additional things to the markup so they have benefits in AI overviews. That can help, but they're forgoing to add that information to the actual content, because the actual content is what the LLMs are trained on. They create data sets, and in the beginning of the trainings of the LLMs, they use structured data websites published as a means to help those LLMs create their own data sets. So it's happening in a much earlier stage of training than actually on the information on the web pages themselves. Markup is used to actually help create those models, but then those models are let go on actual content and they no longer look at the markup.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it aligns with a lot of my thoughts have always been about that. If the content isn't visible on page or page load, the consideration is lower. And obviously, a best practice of Schema has always been not to inject information within the schema that's not visible on the page, and that's been a core of most of the guidelines for a number of years to an extent.
The good news is Google acts pretty pragmatic about it, so they choose to ignore it. But if they ever change their position, and that's in the beginning they were a lot tougher on this, but if they change their current position on how they treat over optimized websites regarding markup, then there are going to be a lot of sites out there they're shooting themselves in the foot right now, because they're publishing more markup than they're actually doing content.
Just kind of touching on that then, segueing slightly away from the kind of top of agencies there, what do you feel that Google may potentially become more stringent with things like structured data abuse penalties, or do you think it'll stay the same just because of the misconceptions of how Schema can influence certain things, and then obviously the overpublication of it and over-optimization?
In my experience, Google engineers are never really happy with the entire concept of penalties at all. If you ask the general engineer I have spoken, their position normally tends to be, nah, we don't need penalties. We need to be able to resolve that algorithmically.
Mhm.
And when they say we need to be able to resolve that algorithmically in regards to structured data, this often means, oh, we need to write an algorithm that ignores those things. So more penalties, not likely. Depending on their backlog, I do expect some things where one of the things that's showing up right now in search are price and review ratings on category listings. If you mark up those products, then you suddenly get a rich snippet for a single product on those listings. That shouldn't happen. It's a flaw in their algorithm. They are aware of that flaw. They just haven't gotten around to fixing it. So will they give penalties for that? No, they'll adapt their algorithms to ignore those things.
Do you think there's a potential just because of how we've seen Google's internal communications work over the years or not work? Do you think there's a potential, even though the engineers are not a fan of the penalties, certain people in search teams will want to still use them because it's that big yardstick of some sort of consequence for trying to abuse or manipulate a certain system, similar to how Google's just updated the indexing API documentation to cover abuse and elements like that potentially.
I think for markup, there's little need to do that. In the end, it's an ROI game. So if you got SEOs spending hundreds of hours on markup for just a few pages, yeah, if that no longer brings any ROI, that behavior will disappear organically as well.
It's interesting you mentioned the ROI side because I tend to see anything in SEO which is, I'm going to call it probably zero sum in the sense of it's a box tick, you can achieve ROI impacts.
Hmm.
It's the discrepancy between the knowledge and ability to sell of the SEOs doing implementation and selling versus the client or the person they're selling to. And because there is so much misinformation out there about the structured data markup, about schema, about how it does or does not influence certain things, even if it's not a long-term play, one-off projects marked up at a certain percentage with low effort now, especially with things like ChatGPT being able to write a lot of schemas,
Hmm.
it's a churn, almost like a churn thing. So that's why I kind of see from a personal perspective where certain clampdowns may come in to discourage the behaviour because I mean link abuse and penguin and all that and the link penalties and things like that. I very much I I tend to refer to them as the three little pigs who built the houses of sticks and whatnot. I always look back at a meme from years ago where the fourth little pig actually built his house of wolf skulls and
Hmm.
might not be very sturdy, but it sent a message to the wolf. And I saw a lot of the early link penalties as being that it's a we know you're doing this kind of manipulation to gain X, Y, Z, stop it. And it's not so much a we want you to stop it for the quality of results. It's a sending that market signal to the market to stop trying to pursue the activity as well, potentially, just for the betterment of the market, I guess.
I think the good news is that markup is not manipulated enough to try to manipulate Google. Sure, it happens. But if you look at the overall numbers on a web scale, the amount of abuse is not that present. Um, Secondly, it doesn't directly influence rankings. So it's also less of a risk for Google to ignore certain things or certain types of behaviors because it doesn't really influence their end results. Um, Markup only influences your rich results, and
Mhm.
that's about it. It's about the appearance. What I find more a shortcoming is that people often look at markup as something they sprinkle on top at the end of the process. And that's where they make the biggest mistake because the markup itself rarely leads to spectacular end results. Where the end results can be found is by structuring the information on your websites, making sure the markup and the content is aligned, making sure you have strong topics, making sure that the content differentiates from each other, that you have unique selling points on each page. And the process of structuring your information, that's where the real value lies of this markup stuff. And if you do that well, then dropping some markup on top in the end will only get you those rich results. But even without the markup, the process of structuring your information in the so-called semantic SEO, that can help you boost your end results. But that's not something like you're dialing two buttons. It's about taxonomies, about your main menu. It's about your content, about the topics you write about. So semantic SEO is not just throwing in some HTML and some markup. It's a holistic process. I hate that word, but it's a holistic process. You have to look at the body as a whole and not single out single things. And I see a lot of SEOs are struggling with looking at the bigger picture. Everybody's doing their best finding that magic bullet. And I don't believe in magic bullets.
I think it's into me industry's nature to always look to commoditize everything as much as possible to scale it to find the magic bullets. And I wrote an article a couple of years ago discussing the semantics of how we use the word semantic and
Mm-hmm.
whether or not the actual translation of it. And I agree, I hate the word holistic, but it is you have to do the 30,000 foot view, I guess, to see the whole body and kind of develop from there. So I kind of
Yeah,
guess, yeah,
I see a lot of people zooming in where they shouldn't be zooming in. They should be zooming out. Look at the bigger picture.
we're too eager to jump in a rabbit hole head first and think we can fix the entire warren from that one entry point. But
Yeah, exactly.
so I kind of guess moving on to the next kind of topic, Ben, and one thing I know you touched on earlier on, just I think you phrased it as you've been kicking shins at Schema.org for at least the past 2-3 years, and um, you've obviously been working closely with them. I know from conversations we've had previously, I think what you don't know about Schema.org and being a workings there isn't worth knowing, being honest.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one
It's
thing
not
that
that
we
have to.
and just one thing that we touched on was just how Schema.org itself is changing, and I'd be curious to get your viewpoint. First of all, just for the benefit of everyone, like a rundown of what has changed recently, and I'd be interested to get your viewpoint on how you see that impacting moving forward.
When Schema.org started, it was like an academic party. All academics, important academics in the semantic space, were there because everybody was trying to create a very common vocabulary.
Hmm.
Although Schema.org halfway through uh, was running the risk of becoming bigger than was needed. Because the original initiative was to create a vocabulary that can be used by search, and it quickly turned out to be turning into a vocabulary about everything. So, and search engines weren't keeping up pace with that. So the vocabulary was developing faster than its usage. So a few years back, things slowed down a bit, and it was decided that we were mostly going to be working on stuff in the vocabulary that actually would most likely be adopted. So that means tickets by the big sponsors, Google, Bing, Yahoo, Yandex. But then the war in Ukraine happened. Yandex disappeared. Yahoo has been in limbo and like what forever, but it hasn't been heard over at Schema.org for at least 8 or 9 years. And Bing has turned silent ever since COVID. We never see any Bing participants any longer. So right now, the only sponsor that's left that's actually actively working there is Google, and those empty quite a bit because of the integration between shopping and organic. So there are a lot of ideas and proposals coming from Google people. And on top of that, ever since August, the two leading people in charge of Schema.org, who are still in charge of Schema.org, of the structure, the organization, RV Gua, long-time Google fellow, has left Google and is now joined OpenAI. And Dan Brickley, the guy who was in charge of the daily running of Schema.org, also has left Google. Again, both are still occupied with Schema.org, but it's interesting changes because things are happening over at Google. Things are stirring up. We all read those documents constantly about people leaving, people being fired. So yeah, it's interesting to see how that's going to be developing over at Schema.org because right now it seems to be Google land.
So, given the, I mean, like I said, there's no one being there anymore and active. There's Yahoo is a folklore by the sounds of it in terms of their interaction outside, and obviously Yandex have pulled back in a lot of things outside of Russia, even though they have just inaugurated a new entity in the Netherlands. Interestingly, Yandex
Yeah.
have. How do you how from a pragmatic neutral perspective? how do you see just the more heavier Google influence due to lack of opposition probably affecting things moving forward? Do you see it as being good for the innovation, bad for it, or
Nou ja,
neutral?
Yahoo and Yandex, obviously, because of organizational changes. Bing itself, what I know from historical conversations is that Bing engineers have never been really crazy about structured data. They sort of liked it a bit, but the general Bing engineer proposition has always been we need to be able to do this without the markup.
Mhm.
So Bing seems to have moved away. Seems they don't make any statements about it, but they seem to have moved away as using structured data for generating search results. It still has some effects, but I'm also seeing that if you structure your content well, you have correct HTML, then a lot of those features also show up in Bing without markup.
Mhm.
Effectively making Google the only player left. And what should happen in my mind is that companies like Meta and Amazon should join. In the end, they use the same type of data sets. Meta actually accepts microdata markup with schema.org vocabulary. Um, and Amazon has an interest as well, because if all those people are now going to be creating markup for Google Shopping, that means Amazon needs to have their data sets aligned as well to stay up with the competition. So in an ideal world, Meta and Amazon would join. Politically, if that will ever happen, I doubt it.
How about OpenAI joining the conversation? Because obviously they're making. I'm in two minds whether or not they will actually ever launch Search GPT as a search engine, just from some of the wording they used around the promo page, and also the fact that a 10,000 user beta for the scale of what they're wanting to launch feels a little bit small, and it doesn't feel like there's as much fanfare around it. What about the likes of them joining as well as Meta and Amazon? Because obviously OpenAI are the yardstick in terms of LLMs perceptually at the moment.
Now, the interesting thing is that with Guha now having joined OpenAI, I'm pretty sure he's going to be uh, very highly involved in getting things done over there with structured data. Um, but since he's the head of Schema.org, why would OpenAI need to join? With
Mm.
him, they sort of like are in there already. And secondly, people have the wrong idea about sponsors. When we normally think about sponsors, we think about organizations putting a big bag of money on the table.
Mm.
That's not the case with Schema.org. What is sponsored is the domain name, is the server hosting is for free. The validator is owned by Google, but Google hosts it under Schema.org, and they pay the bill for that. Um, so they're not actually people working there. It's an open community, sort of ish, uh, but it has no real funding.
No,
They recently launched a new front end for their site. That's like the biggest change on the front end ever since that website has been created, because it's running on the same platform as sitemap.org.
no, but even though there's that financial sponsor side of it, which isn't there, there's the battle of hearts and minds, I guess is the best way of saying it, but supporting things like that. That's why companies, in my opinion, should do more to support things like Wikipedia. They should do more things to support like
Hmm.
the archive. Supporting is publicity, it's PR, and you necessarily see things like, I mean, perceptually at the moment, you probably necessarily see schema.org as being neutral.
Exactly, it's Switzerland.
It's Switzerland, whereas then you've got your OpenAI, which the Overton window and your spectrum of evil varies greatly depending on probably what news story or news cycle's going on around it, and aligning yourself when you're probably on slightly the other side of that spectrum with more of a neutral is positive for brand and positive for outward messaging, I guess.
Hmm.
So the internet equivalent of supporting puppies or something like that, I guess. Because you never can be mad at neutrals or puppies, I guess.
People can be pretty mad at schema.org, because then they start complaining. Why are your examples not up to date? Why are they contradicting what Google wants? Well, exactly because of that. It's Switzerland. It cannot make a position. It cannot make a recommendation about what would be the correct markup. That's up to the individual consumers of that markup. It's like um, compare schema.org to a dictionary. You have all those words you can use, but they don't tell you how to write.
No, exactly. I mean, that's a small percentage who blame the dictionary for the use of the language, and But
Mhm.
the more journalistic feel is it's a neutral, but it's good neutral. It's not an evil neutral. It's a positive thing in the world. Um,
Exactly. There are no opinions about it over there. If you want to use that vocabulary according to your own rules, you're allowed to.
yeah. So if we will sell you the hammer, but we will not tell you how to use it. Or in this case, not even sell it. We'll give you the hammer. We'll give you the toolkit, and you can do what you want with it.
Exactly. And here's sort of like a manual how you can use them, but we're not telling you how you're supposed to use them.
Yeah, like just hold. You'll get better results if you hold that end of a hammer versus the other end of a hammer when you start using it, and it'll probably hurt less. But other than that, go for it yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
So I kind of guess that draws us on to the last kind of topic, the conversation, and I had to put for everyone watching this on the video version, and for the benefit of those actually listening via the audio version on wherever you get your podcast at, I've had to put little quotes around on the words on this. But the question I've got, Jarno, is what excites you about SEO right now? Um, what what
Yeah.
what do you feel is quite interesting to you?
What's interesting to me is not per se a positive, but if I look at search overall right now, and especially globally, it's never been a bigger mess than it is right now. It seems like Google has gotten stupider in some fields. Internationalization is doing weird things. I am seeing tactics working that weren't supposed to work, but are working in Pros Panda. And tactics like keyword stacking and link manipulation are coming back, and maybe not so much as in stuffing links, but certainly the keywords being used everywhere. It's like old-fashioned tactics have made a comeback, and that's sort of interesting in the sense that we've done it before, so we sort of know how to manipulate that. And at the same time, it feels bad because I really for a long time felt yes, we are alleviated of those tactics. And since they're not always the nicest tactics to have, I'm sort of like said, it feels like we're doing a step back. So that's exciting because something changed over at Google to make that happen. And we need to figure out what changed. So yes, that's exciting, but it's not per se a positive.
There's an analogy which I heard someone use at the end of last week. And I think it's quite fitting with this, and it tries to explain what's going on, or that exact same viewpoint, but in the world of sports. Um, so everyone always says Pep Guardiola at Manchester City when he came in, he flooded the midfield. He brought in a different style of play, different tactics, which were an evolution of the old style long ball, which is the back to front long kicks
Hmm.
from the striker. Now, with a couple of the past couple of games have shown, everyone is now trying to flood the midfield and cover the midfield. So now Pep's gone back to just using the long ball, which is the 15-year-old
Yep.
tactics. He bypasses the midfield and it goes through. It's almost like you've evolved to a certain level where now you can go back to the start because the vision has changed. And I think, and this is a conversation I've had with Cindy Crum a couple of times, it's almost like Google's in this constant process of trying to self-correct, but
Hmm.
it's trying to self-correct its own problems it's causing through trying to correct other ones through. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Panda because for me, Panda is one of the most misunderstood Google updates that's ever kind of occurred. It launched 1,000 false positives, which were
Hmm.
then commoditized, and I think with just the general overstimulation of LLM generated content over the past year and a half as well, there's an element of just going back to basics, which I think are working. And however Google's black box of AI is working, it's what we're seeing the gains from, I guess.
The only thing I like, but that's because of certain clients that I have that actually are of the holistic mindset, is that we took notice in some cases that we had been becoming complacent in a lot of things. We relied too much on Google making sense of the titles and the descriptions and rewriting things. So we weren't on top of titles and meta descriptions and H1s and paragraphs like we were maybe 10 years back. And going through sites like that where you actually go through all those things again and cleaning things up and writing proper titles again and taking conversion rates to mind. It's like, yeah, it shouldn't have to influence rankings, But from a user perspective, it's actually pretty nice. Those sentences contain the right keywords again, so that if I land on the page, the person landing on the page recognizes the topic. And so it's not all bad. We have become complacent in certain areas where we simply rely too much on Google understanding things correctly.
I think some of that, though, also potentially comes from misconceptions around different things. So the misconceptions have always been like around dwell time and bounce rate, and even how Google AdSense for some has driven business models. I don't know if this is the same in the Netherlands as it is in the UK, but if you try to find any piece of information on any news publication article, you generally have to scroll past 400 yards of nonsense sentences to fluff it out, probably about 5 embedded adverts. You've got all the post adverts and videos loading around it.
Yeah, we sort of got luck over here with being a small country, non-English.
I am an example I always use when I talk about like TTR times result is I was looking for Arsenal v Mold about 2-3 years ago. We played in the Champions League, and I literally typed the query, what channel is Arsenal v Mold on? And the Guardian ranked first, and the URL exact match to query, article title exact match to query. The article tagline involved a very close variation of the query. The actual answer to my query was 1600 pixels of scroll, 331 words before it, and 7 adverbs before I got to the actual answer. And that's why I think with the AI was partial indexing, was Fraggles, was when Google started doing the jump links for queries in featured snippets. That it was the overcorrection caused by Panda misunderstandings of you need to put as much length into content as possible, but then also misaligned with the business goal of we need people to stay on the page longer because it improves SEO because of pogo sticking, bounce rate, all the rest of it, but also more people on the page equals more ad views, so we can stuff more ads in. So it's like a conflicting.
What I like about that example is because you say that those jump links. I've recently been seeing recipe site results where you see a jump link called "jump to recipe," and you go to the page itself and you look at it, and it's like, yeah, the typical 2,000-word article above the recipe, and actually you have a submenu on that page that allows you to directly jump to the recipe itself. It's like, you didn't get the message, really. That's an indication it should be at the top and the article at the bottom. And people still now throwing in jump links to the recipe. It's like, come on, use your brain.
It's the whole, well, for me, when Google introduced that jump links into feature snippets and things like that, and there was the whole conversation of, how to optimize for this. It was more, I think for me, it was more a question of, no, Google needing to do this shows that we failed the user. We should be in a position where this isn't the case. But it's that misconception of like content lengths, for example, like mandatory things. And I know when Panda first came out, it was the 500-word article was like the gold standard, and some of the tripe that was written between, say, 2012 and 2016 on most websites and churned and whatnot.
I'm the same with Panda and other over optimization algorithms where we stopped keyword stacking things because it had a negative impact, and now we're reverting on that because not the way it was 10 years ago, but the new form of keyword stacking has arrived, and it bears close resemblance to what we did 10-15 years ago.
It's not quite holidays in Spain are great because a Spanish holiday can give you a great holiday in your, like, it's not quite that level of
exactly
space, but it's not too far detached. But anyway, I'd like to thank you for coming on the podcast, Jarno.
Thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you very much for taking the time out. So that's all for this episode. Again, I'd like to thank Jarno for joining me and for your listening, whether or not you're watching the video version on YouTube or listening to the audio version on Spotify or whatever you get your podcasts from. If you like this episode, please do not forget to subscribe, either here on YouTube or on Spotify. And if you do subscribe by YouTube, please do follow the channel and hit the notification bell for more technical SEO podcasts and also the other podcasts and other videos that we put out. I've been Dan Taylor, and this has been the Technical SEO Podcast. Thank you very much for watching.